Good morning, everyone. Thank you for giving us your time today. My name is Dion Jordan. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the director of the Office of Equity and Multicultural Services here at ODHS. And I'll be your meeting facilitator for today. We invite you to connect with us today to hear a preview of the priorities of the 2022 Oregon legislative session and have an opportunity to ask whatever questions that you might have. But before I get started, I'd like to cover a few items to make our time together successful. First, the briefing is being recorded. We recommend you watch the briefing in a side-by-side speaker view. Please reserve the use of the chat for asking questions. Questions will be submitted by typing them into the chat window. Aaron, our ASL interpreter, is providing translation. Elizabeth is providing live captioning. You can view live captioning by opening new window in your internet browser and going to the link that's also found in the chat. As you know, the legislative session is quickly approaching. It begins on February the 1st and runs through March the 7th. In a moment, we'll hear a presentation from ODHS Director Fariborz Parkashev and the department's priorities for the 2022 legislative session. We'll spend about 15 minutes with him, then we'll open up for questions and take questions until around 9:50. We'll hear closing remarks from Fariborz and then we'll wrap up. During our time together, we hope that you will hear lessons we learned from the events of the past 2 years reflected in the priorities of the legislative session. Our experience with COVID-19 pandemic, wildfires, ice storms, quickly brought to surface and made clear the inequities that exist in serving people with color, people with disabilities, our tribal nations, our elders, and limited resources, and other underrepresented communities. We have made a clear commitment to the equity, and this year's legislative priorities are centered on that commitment and supporting human potential. Our priorities include significant requests to improve equity in service delivery, to respond to emergencies and disasters, and to strengthen staffing, meeting the growing demand of the ODHS services. With that said, it is my honor to introduce ODHS Director Fariborz to share more.
Thank you, Dion. Good morning, everyone. Great to see you all. Right now, I see the PowerPoint. I don't see many of you, but when you were all on, it was great to see all your faces. I still remember when we used to do this in the Human Services Building, room 137A through D, and cameras, etc. And I remember that we used to have time to greet each other prior to handshakes, hugs, etc. And we look forward to another time, hopefully not in too distant of a future where we can do that again. I think, this pandemic has really been hard on many, and as Dion said, especially on underserved communities, communities of color, etc. And for that reason and many others, we have been focusing on the issue of equity, racial justice, economic justice. And as a result of that, again, thanks to Dion and his team, with their help, we have developed an equity North Star. You can see the 4 elements, the 4 pillars of that North Star on this slide. And, it does begin with race and intersectionality, but what it leads to, the intent of the equity journey that we're on, is really to bring all of us together as one community, as one agency, as one organization, one nation, hopefully, so that everyone that is receiving our services, regardless of, and you can see on this slide, regardless of where they come from, regardless of their race, regardless of their background, regardless of their place, they can belong, they can be basically achieve well-being, and we'll talk about well-being in a moment. But that work actually happens through connecting with communities, through engaging with particularly communities of color, communities with disabilities, underserved communities, etc., because the wisdom and the knowledge exist in those communities about how we need to be and how we need to do for those communities. At the end of the day, the work is about the people who need our services. We can go to the next slide, please. When you look at this organization, Oregon Department of Human Services, there are three primary things that we have been focusing on and will continue to focus on. One is our core services, strengthening those services, becoming more efficient and effective in the way that we deliver services, doing the best that we can in the present environment with the present tools, policies, structures, etc. The other thing that we have in front of us every day is responding to crises and emergencies. And naturally, those things have become more commonplace, especially within the past 2 years, beginning with the pandemic. Then, of course, we had the 2020 wildfires. We had the ice storm of 2021. We had another wildfires. You know, we had several surges of the COVID with different variants. And for an organization this size, and we'll talk about that a bit, we really need to have the capability and the ability to be able to respond to disasters, to emergencies when they occur. And then the third piece is we can be totally engulfed by the work that's happening on a daily basis, and by responding to emergencies to where we become complacent about thinking about what is the future of not only this organization, what's the future of human services in Oregon, and our role in it. How can we begin to proactively, with the involvement of communities, begin to create and develop that future for this organization, for the entire population in Oregon that need those services. We can go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we have seen during this pandemic is the impact that it has had, like I said, on the people that need our services. And one of the things that we had planned for a long time was to create one door, no wrong door, a common portal to where our consumers, our service recipients did not have to knock on 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different doors to receive their services. With that, we launched the One System. Actually, I'm glad that we did that, because with the increase that we have seen in applications for services, etc., there is no way that we could have had accommodated that rise and surge in requests with the old system that we have. Today, we have nearly 1,350,000 Oregonians who are receiving Oregon Health Plan services, and altogether, the One System serves over 1.5 million, just about 1.5 million Oregonians. The other thing that we've seen is an increase in applications since the pandemic began, to the tune of nearly 270,000. That's about a 26% increase in enrollees in applications. Again, began with the beginning of this pandemic and has continued. Our staffing model was not built for that type of workload. As an example, let me just share with you that the standard across the country, when you look at applications workload compared to a staff, is one staff to about 800 applications. In Oregon today, we are managing that workload with about 1,600 applications to one staff. And that is why we must invest in the system. So part of our ask in this upcoming legislative session is about 328 staff for the One System, so that we can begin to manage some of these applications. We do have a backlog. We have backlog in all the categories of what the system serves. And naturally, this number of staff still does not bring us to where we need to be. We go from about 1 to 1,600 to about 1 to 1,300. But the reality is that, that's an incremental step to get us to where we need to be in order to be more responsive, in order to process these applications and get people the services that they need as quick as they need them. Let's go to the next slide, please. As we talk about being able to one of the things, basically, Dion really covered this really well to begin with. Equity not only is on the forefront of our mind, in the center of everything that we're doing, but it's not just talking about it. It's actually doing something about that. It's actually making the investment that we need. So there is going to be an ask. When I came to this organization about now over 4 years ago, for an organization at the time about 9,000 staff, today we have about 10,000 staff serving 1.5 million Oregonians. We had basically 5 people that were managing everything that related to equity and inclusion in this organization. That is grossly inadequate for an organization of this size. So we're making some investment, asking for some investment in this upcoming short session to basically address not only the racial justice goals of the governor, but also long-standing disparities that has led to local inequities in various parts of Oregon. So basically, we're going to build an infrastructure to help train local staff and deliver culturally responsive services to communities through this investment. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the other part of investment that we're going to make in the system is, this is for our vocational rehabilitation program. We all know that this pandemic has been particularly hard on people with disabilities. In fact, when we look at the data, we see that about 55% of Oregonians with disabilities are not in the labor force versus about 19% of those with no disabilities. And we actually saw pretty much the same proportion during the 2019 fiscal crisis that we faced. Because of that, what we have to do is we have to build capacity to connect people with disabilities to businesses. And that's exactly what this ask is doing from vocational rehabilitation. What it's going to do is create a regional workforce along with business coordinators to increase engagement and outcomes for our business customers. What it will lead to is greater opportunities for our vocational rehabilitation clients, people with disabilities, to get closer to their employment goals. So the ask is basically for 4 regional workforce and business coordinator positions to help carry this work. They're going to be partnering with local businesses. They're going to introduce job seekers directly to employers. They're going to work with businesses to provide them with disability expertise and ongoing support to ensure that long-term the placements of these people with disabilities will be successful, and to help rural communities to have better and increased access to services. Right now, we only have one of those coordinators. And again, this ask is to have 4 of them. We also hope that by increasing that regional capacity, that will allow us to respond more rapidly to those that we serve in the local communities and support a greater workforce participation rate in historically underserved communities. Again, the focus is always going to be on equity. So let's go to the next slide, please. I should just also notice that as far as that VR asked, there's actually no price tag. It's going to be internally funded through VR funds that they already have. So this is about responding to crises and emergencies. Our Office of now the newly named Office of Resilience and Emergency Management is requesting support for capacity building. Again, I shared with you how inadequate, for an organization of this size, having 160 offices in all 36 counties, serving people across this state, to have really just under 5 people to manage all of the emergency function, including continuity of operations for this organization was, again, highly inadequate. In addition to that, we all know that there is anticipation, hopefully it will never happen, but we're talking about potentially this major earthquake, the Cascadia subduction zone, that could be hugely disruptive, including loss of lives, which again will happen. We hope that will never happen, but that doesn't mean somebody said hope is not a good strategy. They have to be prepared. And this is about preparedness. So basically, this is a request to build this office in a way that it can be able to respond to emergencies, to disasters. We already experienced that through the wildfires, through the ice storm, through right now, the office is also helping Afghan refugees that are coming to Oregon. We expect to have about 1,200 of those. And, we'll welcome them with open arms, but we do need to have the capacity. So this investment, you can see the amount, about $38.2 million, will allow our organization to effectively coordinate providing food, providing shelter, first aid, and other emergency assistance in the time of emergencies and disaster. And I should also say that that happens in partnership with local and tribal government and communities. There are a lot of non-governmental organizations that are involved in that effort, and that also helps local communities as far as economic assistance to those businesses, local businesses that will provide many of these services. Let's go to the next slide, please. We also have a community engagement strategy. At the heart of everything that we're doing is community engagement. Because as I have said, and I will talk about this just very briefly in a few moments here, the knowledge and the wisdom exists in local communities. It is the people who are impacted by our services in various parts of Oregon that know best about what works, what doesn't work, what services they need. So this engagement investment is about really greater participation in decision-making by community-based leaders, providing grants to organizations at the local level, addressing racial, gender, disability issues that people, with various, from various communities with different backgrounds, nationalities, or LGBTQ population, etc., face. This also is focused on expanding our tribal affairs program so that they can support the engagement of the 9 federally recognized Oregon tribes across all of our agency programs. And again, in this initiative, equity is going to be at the center. And you'll see that that is a repeating theme as we move through this. Let's go to the next slide, please. Our Office of Developmental Disability Services and our Aging and People with Disabilities program have a major request in this upcoming legislative session. And these investments naturally were not included in our 21-23 budget, but these are to create a number of positions within both of these organizations to focus on continuing and expanding and strengthening the home-based and community-based services. A lot of these are Medicaid funds. You see a huge figure there, $435 million. The majority of those funds are coming from Medicaid. And again, it is to strengthen these systems. Again, these are the population that have been most impacted by this pandemic, our elders and our people with disabilities. And again, when we talk about intersectionality, we're talking, especially if we're talking about Black, Native American, African American, and especially also the Pacific Islander population that have been significantly impacted by COVID. Next slide, please. So finally, what we're talking about here is really creating the future. How do we begin to support our local communities? How do we begin to be responsive culturally for people who are eligible to receive services such as TANF? We are going to be really focused on a TANF reform as we go into this next legislative session through a combination of general fund support and TANF federal funds limitations. We will increase cash supports to help families preserve their resources. We're going to look at increasing eligibility limits. We're going to look at ending some disqualifications in TANF that impact, again, especially underserved communities, communities of color, and leave long-term negative impacts on children, particularly, again, in our communities of color, indigenous communities, or tribal communities. They impact children. And this is part of that creating the future. And this will happen. Again, we will be talking to many local communities. We'll be getting their ideas. Community engagement is at the center of creating the future for Oregon Department of Human Services. We're going to reverse engineer ourselves as far as how we look like, as far as how we are structured, what our services are going to be from the ground up, rather than coming to the communities and telling them, this is what you're going to be doing, this is how you can access our services. We're going to come to you and say, help us redesign ourselves in the way that we're most responsive to you. That's also called the Building Wellbeing Initiative. Again, it connects to our vision. It connects to the fourth element of our Equity North Star. That's the destination that we want to get to. So with that, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I'm going to be now turning it over to Dion and going to see if there are any questions and anything that I can answer.
Thank you, Fariborz. Let's begin taking questions. Chief Financial Officer Eric Moore and Chief of Staff Randy Blackburn are also here to join Fariborz in answering your questions. So we want to take time to welcome Eric and Randy. Because we are a large group, we will be taking questions through the chat. Please type your questions into the chat window now. I will be moderating the questions along with Christy to get through as many topics and questions that time allows. And so with that, let's start with the first question.
Thanks, Dion. Fariborz, I'm hoping you can take the first question. This question is related to community engagement. Regarding our community engagement strategy, does this fund more than talking or investment in actions?
Absolutely, investment in actions. We are keeping in mind that investment comes from the legislature. Funds have to be allocated. We can't necessarily lobby. That's not something that we should be doing, but we are really pointing out the benefit of investing in the community through a series of community grants to help communities identify addressing the issues that exist in their own communities. There have been openness from the legislature. Naturally, right now it's one of the best economic times in Oregon, but as we begin to build that strategy and implement it, investing in communities is at the forefront of our minds. This is going to be as much action as we can possibly deliver and as few talks as possible. Hopefully that's the way it will happen.
Wonderful, thank you. Similar to that same question came through, how will ODDS work to improve their relationships with communities of color?
That's a great question. I think it begins with acknowledging the harm that we have done. And, historically, and really the fundamental question is this. And I know, saying this, I also know that many of our communities of color are tired of us coming to them and asking these questions and not actually delivering. We understand that, we apologize for that, and give us another chance. We'll come back, and the fundamental question is this: how are you experiencing us? What's the experience that you are basically right now through interactions with ODHS? What is your perception of that experience, and what should it be? And that's the starting point. Secondly, is making meaningful changes and meaningful investments. We started a focused conversation with our African American community in the Portland metro area before COVID. After COVID started, we actually focused on the pandemic. We invited our partner agency, our sister agency, Oregon Health Authority, to join us. And I can tell you that the feedback that we have gotten from that community, and one of the most adversely impacted community by a pandemic, has actually made us a better organization. It improved our response to the pandemic. It really brought equity to the surface. That's going to be our approach as we begin to engage with communities of color. And again, the proof is in actions, not in talks. So, you'll be seeing a whole lot more as we move forward within the next, within 2022 around our engagement with the community. It is your voice that's going to be fundamental in creating the future of this organization.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question that came in: what are the actions and accountability for increasing the training and availability of direct care for staff in color and senior communities?
Can you repeat that question again, Dion, please?
Sure, yeah, I apologize, the chat was moving on me.
Oh.
What are the actions and accountability for increasing the training and availability of direct care staff in senior communities?
Naturally, this is a bit out of my wheelhouse, but I'll do the best that I can, and anyone else on the panel should feel free to respond to that. Training is one of the most important aspects of any of the work that we do. Especially again for our people that are being served through APD, through DD. I can tell you that during this pandemic, many things have been disrupted, including there's a lot of virtual training that's happening. We know that may not be the best way to provide training, due to lack of staff. Again, because of the pandemic, I don't want to blame everything on the pandemic, but some things have been delayed and some things have been deferred. But training absolutely is one of the most important elements of not only success, but actually continuous improvement. So we will be focusing on that. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has anything to add to that, but I know if we go to our specific program areas, APD, DD, child welfare, those are the direct service delivery programs. There is a lot of plans for training right now because we know that is necessary for us to be able to deliver our services in the best way that we can.
Wonderful, thank you. So for the panel, when we talk about strengthening rehab with also, or vocational rehab, will that also be paired with holding businesses accountable for not providing reasonable accommodations or not hiring people with disabilities at all? This is a big issue that I've come across.
Accountability naturally is, central to everything that we do. VR actually works very hard, working close with businesses, and those businesses that hire people with disabilities will absolutely have to provide accommodations. That will be monitored, and partnership and accountability, understanding. Myself, it has taken me many years, and I'm still a novice in this thing, to really begin to understand the suffering that people with disabilities, the disability communities are facing, dealing with our system, dealing with our agency, dealing with our businesses. It's a continuing education. So education comes first, agreement comes second, accountability comes after that. So, that's basically the cadence in which we will begin to approach these issues. Now, I don't exactly know the answer around how are we going to hold businesses that don't hire people with disabilities. That may be outside the purview and the authority that we have. There are other organizations within the state. That is discrimination. If you're not hiring people with disabilities, there is legal consequences for that. The question is, how is it investigated? How is it proven? How is it basically then remedied?
Wonderful, thank you. Next question. When you talk about building the future, how are you bringing in equity into the hiring process so that people from those communities who hold those identities will be in leadership roles and a variety of roles?
What a wonderful question. There is a lot of preparation that needs to occur as we focus on bringing and allowing and empowering people of color to actually rise to leadership level in organizations. Naturally, we are making some progress on that front, but we have a long way to go. In fact, I was just talking with our HR director, Audrey Miniweather-Crutch, about this topic. And I'll cite one example. When we look at particular fields, for example, information technology, you see hardly any, very few African Americans and our Latinx population in that group. That's a problem. Now, there are other people of color. There are many people from, India, from other parts of the world that are in that field. That effort needs to begin in high schools. We need to start, and I'm only making that one example in that field. There are other fields that we have underrepresentation of people of color. And we need to approach this thing on multiple layers. We need to start in institutions of education, in high school, in colleges, to start attracting people to those fields and attracting those people to our organization, whether it is through internships and some other things. And then we have to be very intentional within the organization as especially senior level vacancies occur, to do the best that we can to connect with communities of color and to solicit applicants. And I can tell you that our practice in the past has not actively attracted people of color. This may not be today the best organization to work for, but that is our goal. That's our intention. That's where we want to get to. We want this organization to be one that actually not only attracts people of color, but can also retain them, because that's one of our biggest challenges in ODHS. We don't do too bad in hiring people from communities of color, but we don't do a good job in retaining them. That speaks to our culture. That speaks to how we manage our conversations and how we treat people of color in our organization. That's, again, on top of our agenda. That is something that we are focusing on every day and needs much more action than talk.
Wonderful, thank you. A few more have come in. How is ODHS looking to build consistency and transparency as it invests in community partnerships? For instance, we will certainly want to ensure that Oregon's many disability rights activists and service providers are included in the conversation about how to expand these services at the state level. How will ODHS ensure that there's transparency in who is at the table for these conversations?
Again, a great question. And I would welcome, and some of that feedback is already coming in through some of our partners, from advocates, etc. But we need your wisdom and guidance about how we can provide that transparency. We can declare that we're transparent. We can go out and say we are including communities and people with disabilities and their advocates, etc. But when I talk about community engagement, naturally, our people with disabilities are a big part of our equity agenda and initiative. So I will commit, and we will commit, that we will have the conversation with you and get your feedback about how to structure those forums, how to structure those tables. This is about, again, as I said, about education, about rising consciousness, and about the journey. No excuse for what had happened in the past or what's happening now. We do need to own what we have done and what has happened in the past, but we have to be very intentional about what do we do from moving from this point to the future. And we cannot do that without you. So transparency would be, and again, transparency is defined differently, but with love, a conversation specifically with the advocates, and those things are ongoing. It's not that it's not happening, but the question itself is telling us that we are not doing what we need to be doing. We're not delivering on what we claim that we're going to be delivering, and provide us with some of the details. Tell us about what we're not doing, and tell us about what we should be doing. And I can commit to you that we'll take that into consideration as we move forward.
Thank you. Another question that came in: what is DHS doing about the rising homeless in rural communities? We're seeing very high numbers of domestic violence, sexual violence survivors on the streets who are traumatized by the system.
Another great question. It's interesting because people ask me, when you're talking about more applications coming in for SNAP, for TANF, for all this stuff, how can that be? Because we are seeing unemployment rate at this rate, or all these jobs that are available, wages have gone up, etc. The impact of this pandemic on underserved communities, on communities that are close to minimum wage, on communities that cannot afford housing, etc., has been devastating. While the top tier wage earners in this nation have done really well during this pandemic, the bottom layer, as far as earning wages or income, have really suffered. It actually has impacted them even more adversely than they were experiencing before. One of those, you see the signs of those in how the price of housing has gone up, which basically drives the lower income population out of the market. You have seen the impact of homelessness. Now, even though we as an agency, housing is not part of our portfolio, we have a housing and community services organization. We also have local housing authorities, etc. We have to work together. Part of when we talk about creating the future, when we talk about building well-being, we are also acknowledging and sharing with others that it is impossible to experience well-being unless you can have affordable housing. You can have a job that actually pays living wages, so that you can basically take care of your family, take care of your children. You have access to childcare, affordable childcare, which is an oxymoron right now. You actually have access to healthcare. You have education for your kids. You have transportation, all of those things. And for that to happen, systems need to get out of silos and need to work together. There is no magic answer to this thing unless we begin to put the person who needs our services in the center and begin to surround them with what they need. That really is the core of the well-being initiative that I'm talking about. That's what we'll be focusing on within the next 12 months, to build the foundation so that not only do we begin to break the silos within this organization, so that we have known this for a very long time, that it's impossible to serve children without serving families. You can focus again in silos and do perhaps even good work, but that does not lead to the success of the individuals. Even in responding to the wildfires, we have found out the gaps that exist between our system and housing and community services. Some of the people that we are now sheltering in hotels right now are homeless people that have been impacted by fires. And it's a really difficult thing to try to find a transition solution for these individuals, because we don't want to put them back on the street. I've kind of gone on with this answer, but what I would also say that there are social and societal problems that go beyond what we individually as an agency can do to address those. And that's even more reason to connect with other systems and services so that we can collectively respond to those things.
Wonderful, thank you. We have time probably just for one more question. And the question is, will ODHS be providing updates on how agency is shifting from focus on intervention, dealing in the crisis, to prevention, supporting families to remain intact when possible? How can system partners learn about new preventions?
Wonderful question. If you actually look at, I'm imagining, or maybe my perception is that that question is focused on our child welfare program, but perhaps because that's the one system that actually intervenes and takes people out of homes because of safety reasons, because of some other reasons. If you actually have followed the child welfare vision for transformation through the efforts of our child welfare director, Rebecca Jones-Gaston, you will see that there are a whole lot of initiatives in place around early intervention. We have right now, we're running a series of various pilot programs. One of our partners are Children Public-Private Partnership, CP3, a nonprofit organization that's helping us and working with us. Currently in Marion County is going to be expanded to Douglas County, really on two fronts. Prevention happens in various stages of our engagement. The first part of prevention is so that a child would not experience the child welfare system. When we talk about that type of prevention, we're talking about prenatal care. We're talking about postpartum services so that it can actually mitigate postpartum depression. It talks about early learning. It talks about having access to childcare. It talks about an education system. All of those are preventive mechanisms to keep kids out of the child welfare system. And then you look at our practice and how many, when we look at the disproportionality in the child welfare system, again, we go back to African American, Black, Native American communities that are most impacted by our actions in child welfare. And again, a lot of that is done through safety. And then, the other part of prevention is when a child comes into the system and we transition them back to permanency, how do we make sure that that child does not come back into the system? How do we make sure that child does not go into the juvenile justice system? Many initiatives are happening on all of those fronts. And yes, we will be communicating those with you. You are going to be a partner in that. We're actually partnering with Oregon Health Authority, behavioral health, mental health. Those become key components of actually helping keeping children out of the child welfare system and making sure that they're receiving the services that they need so that they don't come back into the system if they're already in our system. So prevention, early intervention are key components of our strategy and part of the Building Wellbeing Initiative. And as I talk about, you cannot serve a child without serving the family, you're going to be seeing a much more closer collaboration, somewhat of an integration between our child welfare system and our self-sufficiency system. Because, I just saw a statistic the other day that a $1,000 investment in earned income tax credit for lower income families, and a lot of that benefit is not being utilized right now, would lead to about an 8% reduction in child welfare involvement. So, there it is. If we can make more investment, if we can provide more services, we also will have to do fewer and less interventions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We want to be respectful of everybody's time, and we want to thank everyone for the questions that came through the chat. Also want to thank Fariborz and the panelists for being available to answer these questions. So before we wrap up, I'd like to ask Fariborz for a few final remarks.
I just want to say thank you to all of you. I know that we had about 300 plus registrants for this session. I see right now we have about 202. At least that's what shows up on my screen. Thank you for giving us some of your time. I want to say with as much humility as I have in me that there's a lot of things that we do not know how to do, especially as it comes to communities that have their own customs, that have their own practices. And the only way that we can be competent in providing those services is by connecting with you, listening to you, helping you guide us, and break down this disparity that exists in power between us and between you. Now, I also would be the first one to acknowledge that this is not going to happen overnight. This is going to be a process. It's going to be a process of building trust. And the way that we have to set it up is that so that it is not dependent on who's leading this organization, so that it is built into the fabric of this organization. So whether I'm here or somebody else is here, what we talked about today will move forward and will never stop. That has been part of the challenge of this organization because we've had so many different directors, and every time you begin to pivot and want to go to a different direction, we have to build equity, we have to build well-being into a strategy that continues with transition continuity. It doesn't matter who's the director, and the only way we can do that is with your help. I appreciate everything that you're doing at the local level to help us help the people that need our services most. I know many of you are advocates, many of you advise us on what we're doing, and please continue doing that so that we can do this together. And we'll have more of these sessions, and love to hear from you and improve in a way that we are most responsive to what our service recipients want and need. Thank you, Dion.
Thank you, Fairboards. So a few items right before we wrap up. We wanted to let you know that materials from today's meeting are posted on our website, and that could also be found in our chat. A recording of today's meeting will be posted next week. We encourage you to sign up for our partners' newsletters. It's a good resource for getting announcements about forums like this and other opportunities for organizations to partner with us and share resources with Oregonians. And connecting on social media is another way that we could help each other share resources with our communities. Several of our program divisions offer their own forums for community partners. If you're interested in getting involved, please let us, or please use this contact information to be added for the meeting's notifications. And that concludes the legislative preview. We will be hosting a post-session follow-up on March 11th from 9 to 10. Please save the date and watch our partner newsletter and social media for registration information. We know your time is valuable, and we have a deep gratitude for making time to join us today. The work of ODHS is done in our commitments by our local staff in collaboration with partners like you. We know the last 2 years have been extremely challenging, and we greatly appreciate your partnership and support in serving Oregonians. We look forward to connecting with you again in March. And I hope that everybody has a good weekend and be well.